At 3 in the morning, Saint Eustace Hospital was engulfed in a deep, oppressive silence, the kind that makes every small sound feel like a scream in the darkness. The emergency lights cast a dim, yellowish glow over the empty corridors, transforming harmless shadows into ghostly outlines. The building, old and worn by time, seemed like a sleeping entity, just waiting for the right moment to wake. There was something almost ritualistic about that hour, when the hospital seemed to belong not to the living, but to the forgotten, to the souls that, according to legend, still roamed there. Sarah, a young nurse who had been working at the hospital for only a short time, was finishing her night shift. To her, Saint Eustace was just another old, dimly lit place, with endless hallways and abandoned rooms that made her heart beat a little faster. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. The murmurs about the forgotten had been passed around among the staff for years. They were legends about patients who had died mysteriously, abandoned by their families, who now wandered the halls searching for recognition, or perhaps revenge. Sarah, skeptical and practical, never paid much attention to these stories, attributing them to her superstitious co-workers or the influence of long, sleepless nights. But that night, something felt different. There was a heavy feeling in the air, as if the hospital were waiting. The atmosphere was thicker, the silence seemed to swallow every sound, and the cold walls seemed to close in, narrowing the path in front of her. Sarah realized she was alone, more alone than she had ever felt. She tried to convince herself it was just her emotions heightened by fatigue, but she sensed there was more. Her heart began to race as she felt the hallway seemed to breathe, as though an invisible presence were there with her. Then the lights began to flicker, casting the corridors into intermittent darkness. Each flicker was a momentary plunge into shadow, and when the light returned, Sarah felt a stronger sense that something was off, misplaced. She heard a metallic sound echoing from some distant point, as if something heavy had fallen. Her body tensed, survival instincts kicking in as her heart pounded. The sensation of being watched intensified, almost becoming tangible. Each step she took seemed to amplify this feeling, and each time she looked back, she saw only the dark, empty hallway, but felt in her core that she was far from alone. The cold, monotonous corridors she had crossed countless times without a second thought seemed different. It wasn't just an impression of change, it felt real, as if the hospital had come to life, as though each wall and each floor held a memory, a pain. And that pain seemed to pulse like a heartbeat beneath layers of concrete and worn tiles. Sarah began to walk faster, her eyes scanning the shadows around her, and then she noticed something peculiar. The doors to the rooms, previously closed and silent, seemed slightly ajar. She could swear someone or something had opened them to watch her pass. Rounding a corner, Sarah saw the silhouette of an empty wheelchair. It was positioned in the middle of the path, an object that should have been ordinary in that setting, but that now seemed out of place, strange. The wheelchair was facing her, as if it had been waiting. She felt a chill run down her spine, but forced herself to take a closer look. The chair was covered in dust, clearly forgotten, but it seemed as if it had been left there on purpose. She forced herself to calm down, reminding herself that it was late, she was tired, and her mind was playing tricks. But the truth was, she had never felt so awake and aware of every detail around her. She could hear her own breathing, and at moments it felt like the hospital was breathing with her. The air around her started to grow perceptibly colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing them in an attempt to warm up, but the chill felt like it was coming from within, something that couldn't be combated with a simple layer of clothing. Looking down the hallway ahead, She noticed the light at the far end flickering intermittently, plunging the area into total darkness every few seconds. In the dim light, she thought she saw something move, a long, misshapen shadow that didn't match anything she had ever seen. The last thing Sarah noticed before hurrying away from that hallway was the sound of something metallic scraping along the floor, followed by an almost palpable silence. She kept walking, refusing to look back, as though she knew that any hesitation would make her vulnerable to something she wasn't ready to face. As she moved away, she felt the hospital was alive, that it was watching her, waiting for something. She didn't yet know what, but the feeling that she wasn't alone stayed etched in her mind, growing stronger, more impossible to ignore. Saint Eustace Hospital was not merely an old building. It carried with it decades of dark, poorly told stories. Since its founding in the 1920s, the hospital had served as a symbol of hope for a town facing an era of despair and desolation. At that time, the town was plagued by a series of unknown diseases and epidemics, and families fearing the spread preferred to hospitalize their sick relatives and forget about them, treating them as mere medical cases, not as people. It was a convenient and cold solution, and over time, the hospital's reputation as the last stop grew among the townsfolk. The hospital was immense, with labyrinthine corridors and a special wing for the most severe and incurable cases. Some said that wing resembled a cemetery of living souls, where patients lay in white beds, weakened and without hope. The air was thick with suffering, the pungent smell of ether and disinfectant mixing with the bittersweet scent of illness and impending death. Nurses and doctors did what they could, but in reality, many of the patients who entered never came back out. As the years passed, the hospital began to be known for its alternative and often questionable methods. Rumors spread among the populace about Dr. Alexander Hewitt, the chief surgeon at the time, a man obsessed with science and understanding the mysteries of life and death. Townspeople saw him as a man with cold, calculating eyes, rarely showing compassion. To him, his patients were not people but study subjects whose lives could be dissected and understood. He believed the human body was a machine, one he could manipulate at will to achieve what he called revolutionary scientific discoveries. These discoveries, however, were made in secrecy. Hewitt conducted procedures on the most vulnerable patients, those who had already been forgotten by their families and the world. In the silence of the nights, he would descend into the hospital's basement, where a clandestine wing had been set up, equipped with medieval-looking surgical instruments and makeshift furniture. Some accounts suggested that Hewitt himself had built a sort of laboratory down there, a forbidden place hidden from any authority. Access was restricted, and only a few trusted nurses were allowed into that space. The basement had become a place of secrets and shadows, a space where the patient's screams were never heard by those upstairs. For many, Saint Eustace was no longer a hospital, but a true laboratory of horrors. Those who survived Dr. Hewitt's treatments came out different, with vacant looks and traumatized expressions, while others simply disappeared. There were no medical records, only shadows in the past, and any questions about the whereabouts of these patients were quickly silenced by hospital directors. Most chilling, however, was the fate of those who did not survive the experiments. Without funerals or any farewell ritual, their bodies were taken to the basement and left in a hidden room, which was constantly kept locked. However, many staff claimed to hear muffled noises coming from there, as if the dead were desperately trying to make their presence known. To them, the hospital had become an eternal prison, a capsule of pain and suffering that would never find redemption. Over the years, these echoes of the past seemed to embed themselves in the walls, transforming Saint Eustace into more than a hospital. It was a silent witness to every procedure, every secret. Eventually, rumors of Dr. Hewitt's experiments reached the administration, and he was quietly removed. The official story was that he had retired and traveled abroad, but many believed he continued to roam the hospital as a shadow, dissatisfied with his work being interrupted. Some say his spirit still haunts the hospital corridors, especially the basement, where he spent entire nights searching for answers about death and life. Sometimes nurses and doctors working the night shift report feeling a presence, a shadow that watches them as they walk through the empty hallways. With Hewitt's departure, the hospital entered a period of decay and neglect. The old wings were sealed off, but even with locked doors, the staff frequently found muddy footprints and dried bloodstains in the corridors leading to the basement. It was as if the hospital was trying to remind its visitors that something dark remained hidden there, something that could never be forgotten. The hospital administration tried to stifle the rumors, but the stories continued, passed down from nurse to nurse, like a living legend. Faced with so many mysteries and disturbing stories, many of the staff who survived Hewitt's era left their jobs, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere and painful memories. But those who stayed, the most resilient, learned to coexist with the forgotten. Those patients who, on nights of absolute silence, seemed to call for recognition. They said that, walking through the abandoned corridors, it was possible to hear faint whispers, as if the echoes of lost lives were begging to be remembered. Time passed, and the hospital closed some of its oldest wings, keeping only one floor active for night care. Few patients were treated there, and most staff preferred to work during the day when the sunlight seemed to purify the place, driving away the shadow of those who never found peace. However, in the early hours, especially on full moon nights, it was as if the hospital breathed again, as if it were waiting for the right moment to reveal all its secrets. New employees like Sarah only knew fragments of this story, but the hospital's dark past was etched in every wall, every corridor. Those working the early hours had to face the fact that they were not alone, that something or someone watched them in silence. The hospital legends weren't just tales to scare newcomers. They were a constant reminder that Saint Eustace kept its dead close, and that these dead, the forgotten, might never truly be freed from their shackles. Those who worked the night shift at Saint Eustace quickly learned that the hospital had a life of its own. Some avoided talking about what they felt, while others shared their experiences in whispers, as if speaking aloud might allow the entities inhabiting the hospital to hear. It was common to hear stories from nurses and doctors that left even the most skeptical listener uncomfortable, as if the very words carried a dark weight. Among these tales, the most disturbing involved a figure that frequently appeared in the early hours, a nurse in a white uniform with vacant eyes and an expressionless face, seen standing at the end of the corridors. Those few who saw her said she didn't move, didn't speak, nor did she acknowledge anyone's presence. She simply watched, her dark eyes like bottomless pits, while a faint smell of ether and blood seemed to emanate from the hallway where she stood. Those who tried to approach or speak to her claimed that before they could get close, she would disappear into the shadows, like mist dissolving in the wind. One of the most well-known witnesses was a nurse named Margaret, a middle-aged woman who had worked at the hospital for decades. She had never believed in legends or ghosts, but after a terrifying experience, she began to avoid certain corridors and rooms on the night shift. Margaret once told Sarah that she heard her name being called in a faint, drawn-out voice while she was walking down the third-floor hallway. Initially, she thought it was someone asking for help, perhaps a lost patient. But as she followed the voice, she realized the sound was coming from an empty room, long sealed. Upon opening the door, she saw the silhouette of a woman sitting on the bed, staring at the wall. When Margaret tried to approach, the woman vanished, leaving only the echo of her voice and an icy chill that filled the room. Another unsettling account involved a young doctor named Daniel, who worked in the emergency ward. One night, while organizing patient records, He noticed a shadow moving quickly down the hallway. Thinking it was a confused patient, he followed the figure, calling for it to come back. Turning the corner, he saw a door ajar, one he knew had been locked for months. Hesitant, he pushed the door open, revealing an empty room, except for a wheelchair in the center and a faint smell of ammonia and something else. Something that reminded him of rotting flesh. He left quickly, but not before hearing slow, dragging footsteps coming from the other side of the corridor. That sound never left his mind, and since then, Daniel avoids walking alone in the hospital at night. Sarah, who listened to these accounts with curiosity, had never paid much attention to the stories. However, that night, something felt different, as if the hospital itself wanted to be noticed. As she walked down the corridor, the echo of footsteps seemed to follow her. Each time she stopped, the sound ceased, only to resume when she took a few more steps. The cold she felt was more than a mere physical sensation. It was a ghostly touch that transcended time and space, a reminder that the hospital held more than just the lives it once treated. She began to feel that the forgotten were not just legends, but real, invisible and persistent presences. The night shift always had a different atmosphere, and those who worked that hour said that once the sun set, the hospital changed. The lights flickered more than usual, shadows moved without explanation, and the air grew heavy, almost as if something was building up, accumulating energy to finally manifest. Some staff reported seeing figures beside sleeping patients, as if they were family members who had never left, waiting for the right moment to escort the sick to the beyond. Others said they heard a low, continuous crying, seeming to come from the walls, as if the hospital itself were mourning the sufferings endured there. There was also the story of the elevator in the West Wing, an old cabin that seemed to have a mind of its own. It would frequently open by itself in the middle of the night, the interior light flickering as if inviting someone inside. Many staff avoided the elevator as they said it had descended to the basement on its own, with doors that wouldn't open upon arrival, as if something invisible was trapped inside. Sarah had heard this story and laughed it off at first, but now, feeling the weight of silence around her, she began to question herself. On another occasion, a nurse named Lucia recounted that one night, as she walked down the corridor, she felt something grab her hand. A cold, rough touch that lasted only a second, but made her shiver. When she looked around, she saw no one, but felt a strong presence, as if someone were right behind her watching. Since then, Lucia wore a necklace with a charm that, according to her, protected her from the hospital's spirits. These stories were shared among the staff almost like a ritual, a way to share the fear and loneliness of the long nights. For many, it was a way to exorcise the fear, to affirm that they were only legends, that nothing could happen. But as Sarah listened to all these stories, she began to feel that something was not right that night. She began to wonder if perhaps the forgotten truly were there, ready to be noticed. The hospital didn't feel like just a building. It was as if it had absorbed every scream, every tear, and every sigh of despair from those who had died without peace. Saint Eustace was becoming, with each passing day, more than a structure. It was an entity that lived on memories, on pain, and on shadows. Every hallway told a story, every door concealed a secret, and for Sarah, that night seemed to be the starting point for an encounter with the unknown. In the early hours of that morning, as Sarah approached room 307, she felt the air around her grow increasingly heavy. The silence, which had once been just an absence of sound, now seemed to pulse as if the hospital itself were breathing. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint flickering light of the lamps that seemed unable to stay lit, as if something invisible were draining their energy. Sarah heard the sound of something metallic scraping along the floor and instinctively stopped, holding her breath. The sound was low but constant, coming precisely from where she was headed, room 307. This room was known by all as a place no one should enter. It had been locked years ago after a series of inexplicable events. They said that a patient, a woman in her 30s, had been admitted there for treatment of a mysterious illness. However, after several treatment attempts, her condition worsened, and she entered a state of constant delirium, screaming and crying every night. The nurses reported that, in her final nights, she whispered the names of people no one knew, as if conversing with invisible entities. On the night of her death, something strange happened. The hospital lights flickered incessantly, and at dawn, the patient was found dead, with an expression of horror on her face, as if she had seen something her mind could not bear. Since then, room 307 had been sealed, but rumors said that from time to time the door seemed to open on its own, as if waiting for someone to visit. Sarah felt an inexplicable urge to enter that room. Her mind told her to turn away, to go in the opposite direction, but her body seemed drawn by an invisible force. When she reached the door, she noticed it was slightly ajar, a thin crack allowing a thread of darkness to escape. Her hand trembled as she reached out to push the door, but with effort she managed to open it, revealing the interior of the room. Upon entering, Sarah felt the air turn icy, as if the space had been frozen at a specific moment in the past. The bed, covered in dust with sheets yellowed by time, seemed like the last witness to the tragedy that had occurred there. An old wheelchair sat in the corner, facing the wall, with a light layer of dust. The silence was absolute. Yet Sarah felt something else there, an invisible presence watching her. As she slowly moved through the room, she heard a muffled sound, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her heart race. As she neared the window, Sarah looked at the dusty glass and, in a distorted reflection, saw the image of a tall, pale man standing behind her, staring directly into her eyes. His features were indistinct, as if blurred by the fog of time, but his eyes were empty, an endless void. Sarah froze, unable to look away, feeling as though somehow the reflection was trying to communicate with her. Her mind fought the urge to turn around, fearing what she might see, but before she could decide, the reflection vanished, leaving only her own pale image in the glass. The room seemed to grow increasingly oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around her. Sarah felt a chill run through her body, and as she tried to step back, she noticed that the wheelchair, once still, was now facing her, as if someone invisible had repositioned it to watch her movements. Fear rose in her chest, her breathing becoming shallow. She looked around, searching for an exit, but the room seemed larger, the corners shrouded in deep shadows that seemed to hide something lurking. Sarah struggled to stay calm, but her body shook with terror. She knew something was trying to communicate, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. A wave of cold ran down her arm, as if invisible hands were touching her, and then she heard a whisper, clearer this time. "Why did you come here?" The voice was faint and distorted, as if from somewhere distant, yet it seemed incredibly close. Sarah didn't know how to respond. Fear paralyzed her words. Silently, she tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination, an illusion caused by exhaustion and the hospital's heavy atmosphere. But the whispers continued, and Sarah felt an even stronger presence, almost as if the figure she'd seen in the reflection was truly there, hidden in the room's shadows. She heard low laughter, as if several people were around her, murmuring things she couldn't understand. The room felt alive, and every detail, the sheets, the wheelchair, the walls, seemed to pulse with an unknown energy, as if each object held its own memory, its own accumulated pain over the years. In a panic, Sarah began to retreat toward the door. But as she turned, she realized the door was now closed. Her fear intensified, and she moved to the door, trying to open it, but it seemed locked, as if the hospital itself were preventing her from leaving. She pounded on the door, calling for help, but the only response was silence. With each passing second, the whispers grew louder, closer, and Sarah felt her mind was on the verge of succumbing to terror. Finally, in a moment of desperation, she gave the door a hard shove, and it opened with a long, unsettling creak. Sarah stumbled out of the room in a state of panic, breathless, and ran down the corridor without looking back. Every step was followed by a sensation that something was right behind her, nearly reaching her. As she fled, she heard the door of room 307 slowly close, as if being sealed once more. But the feeling that something was still watching her followed her down the corridor until she found a safe light. As Sarah ran, she could still hear the whispers, like an echo chasing her. The hospital was alive, and now she knew that those forgotten were not just stories meant to frighten. They were real, waiting for someone to come, to notice them, to acknowledge their presence. The encounter with the forgotten had left her marked, as though she had crossed an invisible line between the world of the living and the dead, and she didn't know if she would ever look at the hospital the same way again. Desperate and still in shock, Sarah ran through the dark hospital corridors until she found the night watchman, an elderly man named Thomas. He was one of the hospital's longest-serving employees, known for his serious expression and tired but deep eyes, as if he knew secrets no one else did. Always quiet, Thomas rarely exchanged words with nurses or doctors, but Sarah knew that if anyone could understand what she had just experienced, it was him. Seeing her so pale and with unsteady breath, Thomas immediately understood that something was wrong. His eyes examined Sarah closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the terrified look she could barely hide. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice hoarse and low, as if he already knew the answer but needed confirmation. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but the intensity in the watchman's gaze compelled her to speak. She recounted, her voice still trembling, about the figure in room 307, the reflection of the man in the glass, and the whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Every word seemed to relive the terror, and she noticed that Thomas didn't seem surprised. He just listened in silence, his face expressionless, but his eyes held a silent understanding. When she finished, he sighed deeply, as if about to reveal a long-held secret. "They've noticed you then," he murmured, almost to himself, before fixing his gaze on Sarah. "The forgotten," he continued, his voice low and heavy, "those who died here and never found peace. They've been trapped in this hospital, caught between the world of the living and the dead. And believe me, girl, they don't like being disturbed." Thomas paused, as if carefully weighing the words he was about to say. "These souls, Sarah, they're not here by accident. Each of them has a story, a pain that was never resolved, a death that went unmourned. This hospital has absorbed these souls over the years, like a cemetery without graves, and every night, especially in the early hours, it's as if the hospital tries to release this accumulated pain. That's why the hallways seem to shift, why the lights flicker, and why you hear whispers. They're here, waiting for someone to remember them, to give meaning to what they endured." Sarah felt a chill as she listened to his words. She had always thought Thomas was just a lonely old man, maybe a little bitter, but in that moment he seemed like a guardian, someone who understood the true nature of what the hospital harbored. "I've seen these forgotten," he continued, with a distant look, "and let me tell you something. They don't like it when someone invades their space. Room 307. It's best not to go back there. That woman, the patient who died there, they say she never found peace. Every time someone enters, it's like opening an old wound, and she awakens, remembering her suffering." Thomas looked around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening, then leaned closer to Sarah, speaking in a conspiratorial whisper. "There are places in this hospital that hold more than stories. They have their own energy, something I've never been able to explain but learned to respect. Those who died here, who were forgotten by their families and left to their fate, seem to have left pieces of themselves. Each time someone enters one of those rooms, it's like opening a door to the past, and those pieces, they try to reconnect. Sarah tried to grasp the depth of what he was saying, but a growing sense of dread prevented her from fully processing it. Thomas continued, seeming to read her expression. Some people who've seen the forgotten were never the same. They say the dead follow them, that they start to see things they once ignored. It's as if the hospital leaves a mark on them, something that can't be erased. I've seen it happen, and I can tell you, once they notice you, it's almost impossible to rid yourself of their presence. Thomas's words sank deep into Sarah, and she began to question what she had felt since leaving room 307. The weight in the atmosphere around her, the sense that someone was watching, the persistent coldness in her arm. Everything now seemed part of something larger, something she had never been able to comprehend before. The silence of the hospital now felt more threatening, as if every shadow around her was alive and watchful, waiting for her next move. Thomas looked at Sarah for a long moment before speaking again, his expression somber. "If I were you, I'd be careful walking around here at night. These hallways, they're not what they seem. Each one leads to places that shouldn't be revisited. But you're young, and I know you may think all of this is just superstition. But remember what I said, girl, the hospital is alive, and now they've noticed you. Once that happens, it's like a door opens, and the forgotten, they think you're willing to listen." Sarah, struggling to control the fear that was beginning to overwhelm her thoughts, asked hesitantly what she should do. How can I protect myself from this?" Her voice came out trembling, a mix of disbelief and hope. Thomas shook his head slowly, as if he knew there was no easy answer. "You must respect their space. Don't disturb them. If something calls to you, don't answer. If you see a shadow, keep walking. And if you hear whispers, ignore them. It's the only way to keep some peace." Before stepping away, Thomas looked at her with an expression that mixed compassion and warning. "But be careful, girl, because once you see what you shouldn't, you'll never be able to go back to how you were. The hospital has a way of keeping those who come into contact with the forgotten, and somehow it always asks for something in return." With her heart heavy and her mind full of doubts, Sarah nodded, feeling a new layer of fear take hold of her. She realized that by crossing the line between reality and the unexplained, she had become vulnerable to something beyond her understanding. And as Thomas's deep gaze followed her, she knew that what he had said was not just a warning. It was a foreshadowing of what was to come. After Thomas's grim warning, Sarah felt panic spreading through her entire body. She knew she should leave, that she should walk away from the hospital and try to forget everything she had heard and witnessed. But something, an invisible, insistent force, compelled her to stay. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear, and despite the chill running down her spine, she felt an almost magnetic pull to uncover the truth about the forgotten. It was as if, somehow, she had been called to this encounter and could no longer escape her fate. Sarah began to walk back toward the West Wing, the heart of the hospital, and supposedly the area where the apparitions were most intense. With each step, the atmosphere seemed to change, as if the corridors were shifting to guide her. The shadows moved in strange ways, stretching and bending in impossible directions, creating a stifling atmosphere. The silence was absolute, as though even the air had stopped circulating, leaving only an oppressive presence that closely followed her. Reaching the West Wing, Sarah encountered a hallway much darker than the rest of the hospital. The light from the lamps barely illuminated a few feet ahead, and the shadows seemed to swallow everything around. It was as if the corridor were cut off from the rest of the building, an exclusion zone where time and space warped. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the tension in the air said otherwise. The floor felt colder, and the air carried a smell of mold mixed with something else. A metallic scent, like blood that had been spilled there too many times. It was at that moment Sarah saw the first shadow move at the end of the hallway. Her heart stopped, and she held her breath, paralyzed by fear. The shadow had an undefined shape, like a thick mist floating, but there was something human about it. An indistinct figure that seemed to be in constant motion. The figure seemed to notice her presence, for it slowly turned, revealing empty eyes that stared at her in a way no living person ever could. Those eyes seemed to carry years of pain and suffering, as though that soul had been marked by centuries of agony. Not knowing what to do, Sarah took a step back, but the figure began to move toward her, gliding down the hallway slowly and silently. Then she heard what sounded like a whisper, a faint, distant voice calling her name. Sarah. The sound was distorted, as if it came from another plane, sending shivers through her. With each step the figure took, Sarah felt the air around her grow heavier, as though she were being pulled into a whirlpool of darkness. The shadow continued advancing, and she realized the hallway behind her was now completely dark, with no escape route. As she fought the urge to run, other figures began to appear in the shadows, slowly materializing along the corridor. They were silent shadows, but each carried an energy that radiated pain and anguish. Sarah realized that these were the forgotten souls Thomas had mentioned, those who had never found peace and now wandered the hospital, bound to a place that had stolen their lives and condemned them to a fate worse than death. Each of these figures bore a desolate expression, pale faces distorted by time, their expressions a mixture of pleading and anger. The climax of horror came when Sarah saw the nurse in white, the one so many had spoken of, appear directly in front of her. She stood just a few meters away, motionless, her face marked by an inhuman, expressionless look. Her clothes were stained with blood, and her skin appeared almost translucent, as if made of mist. The nurse's empty eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for a moment Sarah felt that this figure wanted to convey something, a secret that needed to be revealed. However, before she could do anything, the nurse extended her hand toward her in a slow, deliberate gesture. Sarah, unable to control her terror, tried to step back, but found that her body was paralyzed. It was as though an invisible force held her in place, preventing her from fleeing. She heard whispers coming from all directions, overlapping voices echoing in the hallway, each speaking in a tone of despair. She felt as if she was surrounded by an invisible crowd, each soul trying to be heard, pleading for recognition, for a relief that had never come. The terror grew with each passing second, and Sarah finally managed to take a step back. However, the hallway now seemed distorted, each shadow alive, pulsing with its own energy. She heard shuffling footsteps behind her, and when she turned, she saw a long line of shadows, each one standing still, watching her. That group of ghostly figures seemed to be waiting for something, like patients in an endless line, trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering. The presence of each one was overwhelming, and Sarah felt her mind fragmenting, unable to process the horror before her. She knew that if she stayed there any longer, she would become part of that line, just another forgotten soul among so many others. With all the strength left in her, Sarah took a step back and tried to move away, but the shadow's steps mirrored her pace, keeping their distance as though they were leading her somewhere specific. She felt despair taking over her body, and her vision began to blur. She knew she had to get out of there, but every attempt at movement seemed futile. Finally, in a moment of absolute panic, she closed her eyes and ran in the opposite direction, ignoring the sounds of voices and the oppressive weight of the shadows around her. The hallway seemed endless, and the sound of footsteps and wails followed her, as if the souls of the forgotten were determined not to let her go. When she finally opened her eyes, she found herself alone, back in the main corridor of the hospital, her heart racing and her body trembling with fear. The shadows had disappeared, but the impact of what she had witnessed remained imprinted in her mind like an indelible mark. Sarah knew that experience had changed her forever, and that somehow she had crossed a line, a point of no return. Now, the image of the forgotten would remain forever in her memory, and she felt that, in some way, the hospital had left a mark on her, a mark that connected her to that dark place, to a secret she could never forget. Sarah ran through the corridors, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it echoed throughout the entire hospital. Each step seemed to drag her further into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. She knew she needed to get out, to escape from the shadows that pursued her, but it felt as though the very hospital was conspiring to keep her trapped. The sound of her frantic breathing filled the heavy silence of the corridors, and her vision was blurred by panic and exhaustion. Finally, she reached the main corridor, where the lights were still flickering intermittently, casting long, restless shadows across the walls and floor. Looking back, she saw the shadows of the forgotten still watching her, their still, dark figures with hollow eyes full of suffering. She didn't know if they were really there, or if her fear-traumatized mind was making her see things. But real or not, the image of those figures marked by pain and abandonment was etched into her mind, and she knew she would never be able to forget them. When she finally reached the entrance hall, Sarah noticed the watchman, Thomas, observing her in silence. He seemed to know exactly what had happened, as if he'd seen the same scene dozens of times before, but he said nothing. Instead, he just nodded, as if acknowledging the experience she had endured. There was a silent understanding in his gaze, a dark empathy that spoke more than words ever could. Thomas knew that Sarah would never be the same after that night, and he also knew she now carried an invisible mark, a connection to the forgotten that would follow her forever. Thomas took a step forward and, in a low, almost whispered voice, he said, "Now you understand what this place truly is. Few can see beyond the walls and corridors. This hospital holds more than bodies and memories. It holds souls, and these souls hunger to be seen." His words echoed in Sarah's mind, wrapping her in a deep sadness. She realized that what she had experienced wasn't just a scare or a vision. It was a glimpse into a reality most people could never understand or bear. She looked at her hands and noticed they were cold and trembling. Running her fingers over her own face, she felt the pallor of her skin, the coldness that seemed to emanate from within, as though the touch of the forgotten had left her with a feeling that would never fade. At that moment, she understood that something inside her had changed irreversibly. She was no longer the same person who had entered that hospital. The experience had connected her to something beyond the physical world, something that had stolen a piece of her peace. On her way home, every shadow on the streets seemed to watch her. Every noise made her jump. The world around her seemed to have lost some of its color and taken on an oppressive, dark air. The hospital had left such a deep mark that now everything around her seemed distorted, imbued with a darkness she had previously been unable to perceive. It was as if she had been exposed to a hidden layer of reality, a dimension where lost souls remained trapped, always watching, always lurking. That night, when she finally arrived home, Sarah locked the door behind her and collapsed onto the couch, desperately trying to find some comfort. But as she closed her eyes, all she could see were the faces of the forgotten. The memories of those figures that had pursued her through the hospital, the whispering voices, the hollow eyes pleading for recognition, everything seemed imprinted in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to push these images away, they returned, haunting her thoughts and turning the silence of her home into something oppressive. She spent the entire night awake, unable to sleep, tormented by the visions and whispers that seemed to echo in the corners of her room. Every time she looked into the darkness, she felt something was there watching her. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but the feeling was so real that she began to believe that something, some invisible entity, had followed her from the hospital. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was all a product of trauma and fear, the shadows seemed ever closer, always around her, as if waiting patiently for the right moment to appear again. As days passed, Sarah began to notice that her own reflections seemed different. Looking in the mirror, she saw an expression of fatigue, an emptiness that hadn't been there before. It was as though the experience in the hospital had drained something from her, taken a part of her essence. She avoided looking directly into her own eyes, feeling that somehow her gaze now held traces of the forgotten. Sometimes, when she observed herself in the mirror, she saw dark, undefined shapes around her, shadows lurking, reminding her that the hospital's past still clung to her. Months went by, but Sarah was never able to fully free herself from that night. At work, her colleagues remarked on how she had changed, more introspective, quieter. She tried to smile and act normal, but she knew something inside her had been altered forever. Every time she passed through the hospital corridor where she had encountered the forgotten, a sense of dread filled her, and she avoided looking directly at room 307. She knew it was no longer a matter of superstition or irrational fear. It was a truth that was now part of her life. Deep down, she knew the hospital wouldn't let her go completely. The bond she had formed with the forgotten was real, and she felt she had become a sort of silent guardian of their secrets. Somehow, the experience had changed her, making her part of that forgotten dimension. Sometimes she thought of Thomas, the watchman who seemed to know so well the pains and secrets of that hospital, and she wondered how he could bear to live with this weight. Now, she understood that some secrets weren't just scary stories, but permanent marks that forever changed those who dared to uncover them. After that night in the hospital, Sarah's life never returned to normal. She had become a stranger in her own world, haunted by a knowledge she had never wished to possess. The shadows, the whispers, the memories of hollow faces and desolate expressions of the forgotten continued to surround her, like an invisible and inescapable mark. In the silence of her home, on the loneliest nights, she could still feel their presence, as if the souls crying for help at Saint Eustace had found a new guardian in her, someone who would carry their secrets and pain forever. And you, would you dare spend a night at Saint Eustace Hospital? Would you be able to face the shadows and whispers of those who never found peace? Sometimes, the places we abandon hold secrets we'd rather never know. But are we really capable of ignoring them forever? Do the dead truly rest, or are they just waiting for the right moment to be noticed? If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more mysteries that remain hidden in dark and forgotten places, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every story reveals a new truth that few know, a secret many try to hide. And remember, once you start searching for answers, you might not be able to stop. After all, some mysteries don't want to be unraveled, but once you come into contact with them, they never let you go. Now leave your comment. Have you ever had an unexplained experience in an abandoned place? Or, like Sarah, do you also carry an invisible mark, something that connects you to the unknown? Share your story, reveal your secrets, and who knows, together we might understand what truly happens when the lights go out and the silence comes to life.